Ever just look around and think, man, there's got to be a better way to run this whole society thing? Or maybe you've just wondered, like, how could different societies even work? Like, what would that even look like?
Yeah, for sure. And if you've ever been curious about exploring those kinds of big questions through like classic literature, well, then today's deep dive is right up your alley.
Okay, I like where this is going.
We're going deep on Thomas More's Utopia.
Utopia. All right.
Yeah, think of this as your pre-read primer.
I like it.
We'll give you all the need-to-know info so you can decide if this 500-year-old thought experiment is, worth adding to your reading list. We'll hit the core concepts without, like, spoiling the plot. No major spoilers here.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So, Utopia, published way back in 1516.
That's right, 1516.
As I understand it, the basic idea is that this traveler just happens to find this island nation that, like, supposedly has everything figured out.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah.
This seasoned traveler, Raphael Hiflode, he tells the story of his time on this, unusual island. And he describes their customs, their social customs, their political customs, which are pretty different. And what's really interesting is, like, who came up with this whole concept?
Yeah.
So we got Thomas More, born in 1477, died in 1535, a true Renaissance man.
Oh.
This guy was an English lawyer, a social philosopher, a writer, even a statesman. And he was really involved in the big intellectual movements of his time, a major player in what they called Renaissance humanism.
Okay, so Renaissance humanism. I
Yeah.
mean, for anyone who's not like a scholar of 16th century thought, can you give us the quick version? What's important about that?
Yeah, so Renaissance humanism, it was this huge intellectual movement that emphasized human potential, human achievement, often drawing inspiration from like the ancient Greeks and Romans, and More, with his focus on reason and wanting to make society better, fit right in with these humanist ideas.
I see.
And it shows you how complicated More's legacy is, because this guy later, he's made a saint. St. Thomas More by the Catholic Church, and they declare him the patron saint of statesmen and politicians. This guy also wrote a book that has these ideas about property, these kind of communist attitudes towards property that even like the Soviet Union centuries later admired.
Wow. Talk
Yep.
about a book that bridges some serious divide.
I know, right? It's incredible.
Okay, so 1516 comes along, Utopia hits the scene, and it wasn't exactly a quiet debut. Right?
No, not at all. It was like a big deal. One of the most important and talked about works of European humanism. It really captured what people were thinking about at the time. They were questioning the way things were and trying to imagine different ways societies could be structured. And the way More presented it is pretty unique. It's a dialogue between Raphael, this traveler guy, More's buddy Peter Giles, and More himself. This whole conversational format is really key to how the ideas in the book get explored and debated.
All right, so Raphael, he dishes all about Utopia.
Mm-hmm.
If we were to actually pick up the book, what are the big, like, headline themes we should be ready for? What were Moore's burning questions?
Okay, get ready for some surprisingly modern-sounding discussions. I mean, he dives into religious pluralism, like different religions coexisting peacefully, which was pretty radical at the time. Back then, religious conflict was like the norm. He also gets into the roles of women in society. Now, it's not exactly what we'd call feminist today, but it was definitely progressive for that era. Then you've got discussions about things like state-sponsored education, the utopians' views on colonialism, even when war might be justified. Oh, and of course, the most well-known part, the super detailed description of this almost communist-style city-state governed by pure reason. It's really striking how many of these things, things people were debating in the early 1500s are still hot topics today.
Yeah, you're right. Makes you think about how much progress we've actually made. Okay, so Moore wasn't just like a philosopher up in an ivory tower, was he? This guy was actually out there in the real world, right?
Oh, absolutely. He wasn't just theorizing. Moore went to what we now know as Boston College and Stanford, got a great education, became a well-respected lawyer even, and his career path, it took him right to the heart of power in England. He was a counselor to King Henry VIII and ultimately became the Lord High Chancellor of England. I mean, talk about being in the thick things. This was a time of huge political change and upheaval.
Right. And speaking of upheaval, didn't he have that pretty serious falling out with the king?
Oh, yeah, that's a big part of his story. More was a devout Catholic, and he was strongly opposed to the whole Protestant Reformation thing and Henry VIII's decision to break away from the Catholic Church. Yeah. He flat out refused to swear an oath saying Henry was the top dog of the Church of England, and he wouldn't support the annulment of the king's marriage. This took guts, It put him on a collision course with the most powerful man in England.
Wow. Talk about standing by your principles.
Exactly. But it came at a huge cost. His unshakable beliefs led to him being imprisoned, put on trial for treason, and ultimately executed.
So Thinking about Moore's life, being right in the middle of all that political drama, the social turmoil of his time, wars, poverty, inequality, it's hard to believe that utopia wasn't, like, in some way a response to all of that, right?
You hit the nail on the head. A lot of historians and literary critics see utopia as this like veiled commentary on all the things wrong with England in the early 1500s. By creating this fictional island, Moore can talk about the problems he saw all around him, but in a less direct way, maybe with a little less risk to himself. I mean, considering his own experiences with political maneuvering and how unequal society was, it makes sense that utopia grapples with themes like the dangers of power and the huge gaps between rich and poor.
Right, right. Okay, so that brings us to that big, always debated question. Was Moore really pushing for this utopian society as a literal model? Was he saying, hey, everyone, this is the blueprint, let's do this? Or was there, like, a layer of sarcasm, of satire going on?
That is the million-dollar question with utopia. Was it a serious proposal for a better way to live, or was it more of a witty jab at the whole system, at European politics and society? It's fascinating because Moore himself came up with the word utopia. And get this, the word utopia, coming from Greek, it can mean both no place, like it doesn't exist, and also, with just a slight tweak to the word, it can mean good place.
Oh, interesting.
So right there in the title, you've got this built-in ambiguity that hints at how complex Moore's intentions might have been. If you lean toward the no place, meaning it suggests this ideal that's probably impossible to achieve, that would point more towards satire.
So maybe a book meant to get people thinking, whether he actually believed in the specifics or not? Okay, well, over the centuries, utopia has definitely made an impact. It's become pretty famous. Why is it still seen as an important book? What kind of praise has it gotten?
It's hard to overstate its historical importance. It's a founding text, a cornerstone of both political philosophy and what we now call sociology. You could say it basically kicked off the whole genre of utopian and dystopian literature. I mean, it's widely considered a classic and a really insightful piece of sociological and political satire.
So what specifically has resonated with people, with critics? Why all the praise?
Well, a lot of people appreciate how it takes these big abstract social problems and shows how they would affect real people's everyday lives. It's not just dry theory. And it's often praised for being an important work that takes this, surprisingly compassionate look at this basic human desire for a more harmonious and moral society. People also point out how relevant the questions Moore raises still are today. Stuff like wealth inequality, the government's role, the search for happiness, and let's not forget how witty and imaginative Moore's descriptions of utopian society are. It's definitely not a boring read.
Right, right. So it's thought-provoking, but also a good read.
Yeah.
Okay, but obviously, looking back at it now from a modern perspective, utopia isn't perfect, is it? There are definitely some things people criticize about it. What are some of the main critiques?
Oh, yeah, for sure. When we read Utopia today, some things really stick out as problematic. For instance, the way women are treated in this utopian society, sure, maybe it was progressive for its time, but it doesn't line up at all with our ideas about gender equality today.
Right.
And then there's the fact that slavery actually exists in this supposed ideal society. That's a big point of criticism. It can be pretty jarring for readers today. And then there's the whole lack of individual privacy for the utopians. Like, they don't seem to have a lot of personal freedom because it's all about the collective good.
Yeah.
That brings up some big ethical questions.
Yeah, slavery in a perfect society. That's a tough one to reconcile. What else do people point to as, not so great?
Well, the intense focus on work and this almost obsessive avoidance of idleness, that can feel kind of authoritarian, And hard labor is actually a common punishment, which seems pretty harsh. Some critics have argued that Moore's utopia could easily become this, tyranny of happiness and isolationism, like you're not allowed to express yourself or disagree because everything has to be stable and harmonious. And the amount of social control, the potential for constant surveillance in the utopian system, those are definitely red flags for people today. And, I came across this one reader's reaction that kind of sums it up in a funny way. They said, utopia feels like the same old bullshit, but make it pre-communist. It kind of makes you think maybe underneath all that supposed perfection, some of the same human flaws are still there.
Right. So it sounds like reading Utopia can trigger some pretty strong feelings. What have people who've actually read it had to say about their experience?
It's interesting. Reader reactions are all over the place. A lot of people find it really intellectually stimulating and surprisingly relevant to the problems we're facing today. It makes them rethink their assumptions about how society works. Others, though, find it less enjoyable as a straight-up story. Okay.
The structure with all the dialogue can be dense sometimes. Some people say it's hard to follow, almost like you're reading a philosophical play instead of a novel.
A philosophical play, huh? So not your typical page turner. What else have readers said they got out of it?
Well, a lot of people interpret Utopia as a critique of European society during More's time, pointing out all the social unrest and inequality that was going on. Some readers were struck by how radical some of More's ideas must have sounded back in the 16th century, even if those ideas seem kind of unrealistic or even silly now. And there's often this sense that More was sincerely trying to figure out how to make society better, even if his solutions are debatable.
Makes sense.
And going back to the satire element, some people see it not as a literal roadmap, but more like a timeless reference point for evaluating our own societies. Like it makes you think about the basic principles that we're built on. Interesting. It's more about sparking self-reflection than saying, this is the exact answer.
Yeah.
Okay, let's dig a little deeper into the book itself. We've talked about the dialogue, the satire. From a literary analysis standpoint, what else jumps out?
Well, the whole structure as a dialogue, it lets Moore explore these complex ideas from different angles without necessarily saying, this is the right way to think about it. That ambiguity is a big part of what makes it interesting from a literary perspective. And the satire, like we've talked about, is super important too. But scholars are still debating exactly what he's satirizing and how harshly. Is he mainly poking fun at specific policies in England, or is it more about the whole idea of a perfect society?
And then there's Utopia itself, this fictional world. What's the significance of that from a literary point of view?
Yeah, the brilliance of calling it utopia is that double meaning. It means good place, but it also means no place. That contradiction is baked right into the book's impact. It forces us to ask, can we ever achieve a truly ideal society? Or will it always be this imaginary thing that we can never quite reach? That tension between the ideal and the impossible, that's a big part of why the book is still so powerful.
I see. Were there any specific books or philosophers or writers that had a clear influence on More's writing?
Definitely. Plato's Republic, with its detailed vision of an ideal state, that's a clear forerunner and influence. Some scholars also think there might be connections to St. Augustine's City of God. And don't forget, More was writing during the Age of Exploration. All those stories coming back from the New World, those probably sparked his imagination about different cultures and ways of organizing society. You can see hints of those real-world encounters in some of the utopian customs.
Cool. So he's drawing on ancient wisdom and the new discoveries of his own time. There's also that interesting idea that More might have intended Utopia to be more of a warning, like a dystopia disguised as a utopia.
Yeah, that's a really compelling interpretation, and more people are leaning towards that view now. The argument is that all that rationality and order in utopia, it seems like it's creating a perfect society, but maybe it's actually coming at a cost. Maybe it's sacrificing essential human qualities, things like individuality, spontaneity, even real compassion. In this reading, the very perfection of utopia becomes its most scary flaw. It's like saying a society built solely on reason might end up crushing the human spirit.
That's a pretty dark twist. A cautionary tale dressed up as a dream. And you mentioned earlier how Utopia let Moore talk about some touchy subjects in a more indirect way.
Exactly. By putting his exploration of these potentially controversial ideas, things like communal ownership, alternative religious structures, different approaches to marriage and family, by putting all that in a fictional, faraway land, he could engage with these topics without being quite so confrontational. It gave him a little bit of cover, you know? He could spark debate without necessarily being seen as a direct threat to the powers that be in England.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. The themes, Moore's fascinating life story, the praise and the criticisms, how readers react to it, even some of the literary aspects. Now, the big question for our listeners, who should actually consider picking up Utopia and giving it a read today?
Well, if you're genuinely interested in political thought, or if you're intrigued by Renaissance history, or if you like exploring those early utopian and dystopian ideas in literature, then Utopia is definitely worth checking out. It's one of those foundational texts that still speaks to people who like to think deeply about how societies function and what a good life actually means.
But it's not necessarily for everyone, right? Especially if they're looking for something light and easy.
Yeah, exactly. If you're mainly looking for a fast-paced, plot-driven story with characters you really connect with, Utopia might not be your cup of tea. It's more of an intellectual exercise. You know, a journey through a thought experiment presented in this really unique, sometimes challenging format.
And even if some of the specific things Moore proposes feel outdated or even troubling from our perspective today, there's still value in engaging with this book, right?
Absolutely. It's a valuable piece of history that gives us a glimpse into what people were worried about, what they hoped for, and the whole intellectual climate of the 16th century. Even if you end up disagreeing with a lot of what More describes in Utopia, the questions it raises about justice, equality, power, and how to create a better world, those are still incredibly relevant. They make us think about the societies we live in today.
So after all this talk about utopia, I have to ask, what does your ideal society look like? And maybe even more important, what does imagining that perfect place, even if it's nowhere, just like Moore's Island? What does that tell us about the good and bad things about the world we're actually living in right now? It's powerful stuff, this human need to dream up something better, even if that something better only exists in our minds.